listener production.
Hello, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. After weeks of speculation, US President Donald Trump has confirmed Australia will be among the latest targets in his tariff war. But what is a tariff anyway, and how will this affect us here?
Let's be very, very clear. There are winners and losers from tariffs. There are winners and losers from no tariffs. That's 1,000,000% true.
What Trump targeting Australia means for you and what the government could be doing about it. That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spiru on Tuesday, February 11.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Sam Kerr is being made to sweat it out, with the jury in a racial harassment trial now considering its verdict. It retired early this morning, our time, and hasn't delivered a swift judgment. They'll be back later tonight, our time again, to continue deliberations. So as we wait, a reminder of how we got here. This all stems from a night out in 2023, and that was when the Matilda star and her partner Christy Mewis were taken to a South London police station. And that was after Kerr had been sick in the back of a cab. That sparked a dispute over cleanup costs, with the couple claiming the driver then locked their door and began speeding and swerving, prompting Mewis to smash a window to try to escape. At Twickenham Police Station, Kerr called an officer stupid and white after he doubted her claim of being held hostage by the cabbie.
A year later, the 31-year-old was charged with aggravated racial harassment of the officer, and she pleaded not guilty to that. So in closing arguments overnight, the Chelsea Strikers barrister told the jury the conduct of police that night was completely unacceptable after they failed to take her claims of false imprisonment and dangerous driving seriously. Her lawyer also cast doubt on whether the police officer suffered alarm or distress by Kerr's comments, noting it was not in his original statement, and added 11 months after the prosecution said there was insufficient evidence to charge the football star. If found guilty, Kerr faces 26 weeks jail time. And as we talked about yesterday, Chris, it remains to be seen what happens to her football career, but she has had messages of support from Chelsea in the Women's Premier League in England, of course, the team she plays for. Also, she is still listed as the captain of the Matildas, and the Australian government has also come out in support of her.
Hamas has announced it's pausing the release of any further Israeli hostages. The group has released a statement claiming Israel has repeatedly violated their ceasefire deal over the last 3 weeks. Among the alleged breaches, according to Hamas, is the delaying of the return of Palestinians to northern Gaza, the continued shelling and shooting at Palestinians across the Strip, and failing to allow enough aid to enter the territory. More hostages were due to be released this Saturday.
Israel has denied accusations that it hasn't been letting enough aid through, but we do know that it did delay the opening of crossings in the Netzarim corridor, which prevented displaced Gazans from crossing between northern and southern areas of the Strip. Meantime, Donald Trump has again doubled down on his plans for the Gaza Strip in an interview with Fox News.
I would own this. Think of it as a real estate development for the future. It would be a beautiful piece of land.
Would the Palestinians have the right to return?
Spent. No, they wouldn't.
So the US president went on to talk up his ability to do a deal with Jordan and Egypt to resettle 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, something once again that a number of Arab states, including Jordan and Egypt, have all outright rejected and slammed. However, Trump is due to meet King Abdullah of Jordan in the next day or so. I mean, you can only imagine what the topic of conversation will be. So, you know, we know that Trump likes to put himself up as a businessman. I mean, he is a businessman. And, you know, you look at what happened with the tariffs with Mexico and Canada and how he was able to negotiate things that he wanted by making these huge threats. However, experts still don't think this can happen, that he is just saying it, and that it really does require the cooperation of the Arab states to resettle Palestinians. Really scary, though, those comments that Palestinians would not have a right to return. Initially, we kind of tiptoed around those questions, but he's come out and said, no, they wouldn't have a right to come back. So whether it happens or not, it's still really scary comments from the leader of the free world.
The opposition has walked back Peter Dutton's promise to axe thousands of federal government jobs if elected. The Nationals leader David Littleproud saying hardly any public service jobs will be on the chopping block, but with a caveat that they will be looking and prioritising where those public servants are, making sure they, quote, get the right balance.
It was late last month when Dutton appointed Jacinta Nampijinpa Price as the Shadow Minister for Government Efficiency that he set his sights on these 36,000 new-ish public servants that were employed under the Albanese government. He claimed they cost the taxpayer $6 billion a year. Similar claims had been made by Littleproud last year. But yesterday, the Nationals leader provided somewhat of a guarantee, saying the roles had been budgeted for and would not be cut. So an interesting clash there of ideas between the two main leaders of the parties within the coalition.
Yeah, and when pressed earlier this month about his plans for cuts and what departments they would impact specifically, Dutton said he would reveal the details in due course. At the time, his announcement was slammed by Labor, with Finance Minister Katie Gallagher warning it would lead to further delays and wait times for critical services like Centrelink, the ATO and NDIS, and would lead to further outsourcing of our frontline services. I mean, the conversation around efficiency, I know a lot of people are getting a little bit stressed that it's us mimicking Donald Trump and Doge and Musk and the efficiency department. But I guess the conversation around efficiency is important to be having as a society. You know, this idea of cutting wasteful spending is a good thing, especially in amongst a cost of living crisis. I guess the finicky and tricky point is when you're cutting jobs that then lead to further delays. So if what Labor is warning is true, if that's something that will happen, I'm sure it will spark outrage. If it isn't, it'll no doubt be chalked up as a win for the coalition.
Look, there has been a pre-election win for Anthony Albanese as well, just while we're speaking of federal politics. So the core of his Future Made in Australia bill has now passed the Senate. So a reminder, this is a $13.7 billion commitment in relation to tax breaks for critical minerals processing and green hydrogen production. What does that all mean? Well, basically, why this is important is because Labor is claiming it will use the tax breaks to kickstart emerging green industries, but also help protect Australia from China's stranglehold on the global critical mineral supply chains. So that is the intention behind these bills. It did get through with the support of Greens and the crossbenchers, but the coalition refused to support it, claiming it was billions for billionaires. And Super Bowl 59 will go down as one for the ages. There was plenty to keep sport, music and politics fans happy. Tick, tick, tick. Let's start with the main event, the actual game. The Philadelphia Eagles broke the hearts of the Kansas City Chiefs at Caesars Superdome in New Orleans. Philly ended the Chiefs' hopes of a three-peat, and history was also made with the first ever Aussie player taking to the field and winning a Super Bowl. Woo-hoo. So this was 27-year-old Jordan Mailata from the southwest Sydney suburb of Bankstown from the area. He waved the Australian flag on the field after the win, and he also talked about the interesting way he wanted to celebrate.
Well, I'm on a time schedule. You know, I've got to go shower. I've got to go celebrate, and
Well, go celebrate your body. You deserve it, mate.
Yeah, I'm taking my wife with me.
I just feel like the adrenaline's so high for players after they win, they just say whatever comes to their mind. That was Mailata speaking to Channel 9 there after the big win.
Of course, we also have to talk about the two biggest names in the crowd, Taylor Swift and Donald Trump. Poor Tay-Tay, she was booed. She had a great side-eye for the crowd when that was happening, but maybe she didn't expect the US president to join the pile-on, which he did. Trump taken to Truth Social to share the video of her getting jeered by the crowd, posting it side by side with footage of him getting cheered at the game. An interesting comparison. In a separate post, he wrote, "The only one that had a tougher night than the Kansas City Chiefs was Taylor Swift," adding that MAGA fans were very unforgiving.
But the best beef of the night was reserved for the halftime show.
Say, Drake, I hear you like I'm young. You better not ever go to cell block 1.
Oh, yes. That was Kendrick Lamar dissing fellow rapper Drake, who happens to be in Australia right now for his tour, actually. There was footage of his team watching the halftime show at Crown in Melbourne, I believe. And they were, you know, that Pikachu, shocked Pikachu face. Like, look, Kendrick also brought out Serena Williams, who's Drake's ex, to crip walk during Not Like Us. It was really great. I've had not like us playing through my head for the last, 12 hours. It was such a great halftime show. But to summarise all up, there was plenty to like about Super Bowl 59. And hey, I noticed today all the talk online and all of the major news sites, there were write-ups about the Kendrick-Drake beef. We did deep dive this last year when it was first kind of really bubbling up, and that was with hip-hop journo Simone Amelia Jordan. And we've linked it in the show notes. If yesterday was like a reminder to you that you want to be like, oh, what happened between them again? I'm going to go listen to the briefing.
Which is a great shout.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. Next up, yes, we talked about him in the headlines. We're going to talk about him again because he's announced tariffs that could impact Australia quite significantly. We're getting into a deep dive about Donald Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminium next.
Any steel coming into the United States is going to have a 25% tariff.
What about aluminum?
Aluminum too.
Hey, Bension here. And that was Donald Trump speaking to reporters on Air Force One yesterday, our time, popping that little bubble of hope that Australia might have been spared from Trump's big trade war. Or popped for now, at least. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says he'll have an urgent phone call with the US president just to see if he can do a Malcolm Turnbull and convince Trump to tariff other countries and keep us the hell out of it. But what is a tariff?
The word tariff, properly used, is a beautiful word. One of the most beautiful words I've ever heard. It's music to my ears.
Beautiful or otherwise, a tariff is a tax the US government puts on goods from other countries. So something made in Australia, then sold in America, becomes more expensive in a bid to make that American person buy a similar product that's made in America instead. The Australian share market certainly didn't think this idea was beautiful. Billions of dollars were wiped off the value of companies including BHP and Rio Tinto yesterday. But this is not actually a story about big companies. If Trump follows through with these tariffs, it would have big flow-on effects for you and for me and for everyone. So to help us understand what might be coming for us and what the government could do about it, we've got Scott Phillips. He's the Chief Investment Officer at the Motley Fool. Scott, welcome back to the briefing.
Bension, thank you for having me.
If Trump follows through with these tariffs, what's it going to mean for people listening right now?
Oh man, that is a $64 question. So two parts. If he follows through, so there's that bit. What does it mean? Look, immediately, almost nothing. But what tariffs do is they put up prices for everything effectively in America in the short term, and then often in the other countries as they retaliate in the medium term, and it makes us all worse off. And it does it because it props up the uneconomic forces. Now, many of your listeners will be too young to remember, there was a time when Australia produced our own cars. And they were okay cars. I drove a Holden Commodore and was very happy with it for a while. But what it ended up doing was it meant that the imported cars were more expensive and the local cars weren't quite as good. But we really didn't have a choice. You chose between a slightly less expensive, locally produced, lower quality car or a slightly more expensive international import. Once you take that away, once you say, you know what, let's let the market do its thing. Now, I'm not a free markets and no regulation kind of guy. I'm a good regulation guy. But what it means is when you let competition happen, people who do things well send them to us. And when we do things well, we send them to them. They get the benefit of our better know-how, higher quality, cheaper product, and we get the same in reverse. Once you gum that up by putting tariffs in place, you make everything more expensive for everybody, and it is just awful economic policy.
Tariffs are a bit confusing because they're a tax on Australian products that Americans buy aimed at harming Australian businesses.
Yes.
So bear with me here. I want to see if I can come up with a practical example. Does this mean that American person walks into the Walmart, they're looking for chicken wire, it's manufactured in Australia, that's going to be a lot more expensive?
That's exactly it. And when Donald Trump says the tariff is on Australian products, that's true. What he's really saying is the tariff is on American consumers who buy Australian products because they'll be more expensive for the Americans to buy as a result.
Very quickly after Trump said that he was going to tariff Canada specifically, they said, all right, we're going to tariff you right back. And this is the whole tit for tat thing that happens with tariffs. Should Australia do so? And if so, what would that mean for us at the checkout?
It's kind of one of those things where, you've got a broken leg, I've got a sprained ankle, and I say I'm better than you. I mean, at the end of the day, we're both hurt, right? We're both struggling, we're both suffering as a result. Should we put tariffs on? At some level, you've kind of got to say, if I accept their tariffs and don't do anything here, then the average Australian is worse off. And you're in this, you're right, it's tit for tat, but you're thrust into this world of what's least worst. There's no best, there's just least worst. So is it I cop the tariffs and I just lose jobs and businesses, or I cop the tariffs, I put tariffs on them and hope some of those workers can move from one industry to another? The problem is, what happens then? And it's probably likely Donald Trump says, well, okay, I did it to you, you did it to me, so I'm going to do it back to you again. And then where does this finish? And this is the problem with foreign policy, trade policy being done by someone who, frankly, is the schoolyard bully. And I have no sense that he is trying to do what is in the best long-term interest of the US, rather than the thing that knee-jerk he thinks, I don't like China, I'm going to make their products hurt. And this is where it's problematic, because it makes it worse for Americans and Australians. And you kind of think, well, who wins out of that? In the short to medium term, mate, it's possible, by the way, that it seems better for America. If unemployment was to fall because more Americans are employed, you could say, look what I did, I fixed the Rust Belt in America, for example. I put some more Americans back to work. That might even be true. What it doesn't count is the diffuse costs. In other words, everyone's paying more for Australian chicken wire, to use your example. And over the medium and long term, American businesses, the less productive, the unprofitable, the borderline broke businesses, they get some workers so they can effectively run a government subsidised industry, get sucked away from businesses that are currently profitable and jobs that are currently worth doing for their own sake. So you also dumb down the American economy. You make it less productive, because all of a sudden marginal steelworks in the US grab people out of and pick whatever industry you want. They do well. I'll say aerospace for the fun of it. All of a sudden, so then there's less people available for the industries that actually do well and compete well with internationally. And those companies get hurt because they want the workers back. We often think about the first order impacts. If I do this, what will happen? But then you've got to say, what's the second order? What does that cause? And what does that cause? And what does that cause? When you flow it through, by the way, we used to have, I think few viewers of a certain age, under my age, we used to have lots of tariffs in the 60s and 70s and 50s, heaps and heaps of tariffs. And economists and governments realised taking them down was actually good for everybody. We've been here before. This is the frustrating thing. We know what it's like, and we know the benefits that come when you remove those tariff barriers. Our standard of living is much improved. Not every company, every industry, every worker. Yes, we lost some jobs, lost jobs in textiles, for example, when clothing went to Bangladesh. That sucks for those textile workers. But guess what? We all now buy much, much cheaper clothing than we otherwise would. And so we're all better off by a greater degree that if we'd kept protecting those jobs. That's why the cost of living stuff is really important here.
Speaking of the cost of living stuff, if we were to put our own tariffs on US goods, then will we just get the same chicken wire problem here, that we'll just be paying more at the checkout?
Correct. That's exactly what will happen. Now, governments might say, well, I'm doing that to protect the jobs that otherwise would be lost, and that's what Trump's effectively saying in reverse. But yes, you're exactly right. Think about American whiskey, for example, bourbon coming into Australia. All of a sudden, it's $40 bottle of Jim Beam's now $45, right? Mm-hmm. No one wins from that. The Australian consumer is $5 poorer. That $5 would have gone into buying, let's stick with the bourbon and Coke example, a bottle of Coke, but now you can't afford the Coke because you paid more for the bourbon. So you're buying less stuff. The same number of dollars doesn't go as far as it would. We've lived the cost of living stuff now for 5 years, right? We know what it's like when there's the same amount of money, but everything's more expensive. You buy less of it. You don't have a choice. When we put tariffs on American products or anyone's products, every time you either don't buy it, so you miss out, or you do buy it, and the extra money's got to come from somewhere else, so you don't buy something else instead. And again, this is why this is, as someone who lives and breathes economics and finance, tariffs are so incredibly frustrating because it sucks buying power away. You can buy fewer things with the same money. It is an absolute own goal. Now, again, Trump will stand on the nationalism bully pulpit and say, I'm doing this for American jobs and I'm looking after America, I'll make America great again. At a first order impact, it looks really good. I'm hurting China so as American workers can have jobs. Feels really good. And if it stopped there, he'd be right. But it doesn't stop there. And that's a completely self-inflicted wound.
Can I ask you about one of the other potential impacts of this? If Australian miners pull less iron ore out of the ground and Australian steel manufacturers make less steel here because of these tariffs, does that flow on to less tax money for the government to pay for things like health and education?
Yes, massively. And it's not even really about the steel makers here, it's the iron ore. Because remember, these tariffs are going on globally from the US. So who makes a vast amount of the world's steel? China. Who is our major trading partner? China, 1/3 of our exports almost all iron ore go to China. If you take that away and you think about the royalties at state level, WA in particular in this case, but it could be others, and you think about the federal government's corporate tax revenues from BHP, Rio, Fortescue, and the smaller guys as well, and if you think about the volumes that fall as a result, and the price falls as a result because there's tariffs, so everyone's buying less of it, so the price is going to come down. In either or both cases, that means a lot less money for the federal government budget. And so we've got a couple of surpluses in a row, but the government's predicting endless deficits. By the way, the opposition is no better, so let's not make this party political. And you then take away some iron ore revenue, it only makes the whole lot worse. The best news probably, and this is again in the least worst stakes, there's actually not that many people employed in mining. For all of the carry-on, it's not a big issue when it comes to employment. I mean, it's going to hurt some people. Again, I don't mean to be flippant about it, but at a national level, it's a very small number. But the budget impact, as you rightly point out, is where we're going to feel the pain. Now, whether there are fewer services or simply more debt, both of those are really, really bad option economically because we've already got debt that's approaching $1 trillion. This is not good for Australia's budget, no matter which way you cut it.
Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, getting onto the politics, has said, including on this podcast, how he convinced Trump not to tariff Australian steel when he was Prime Minister because of this trade surplus, because Australians spend more buying US stuff than United States people buy our stuff. We are still in a trade surplus. Gina Reinhart seems to be a good buddy of Donald Trump. We had trade representatives up there talking about AUKUS. How come he's tariffing us now? What's different?
I could say because Donald Trump's Donald Trump, Bension, but I'm not sure that's particularly helpful. It's probably true, but it's not helpful. Trump partly wants to charge tariffs because he says he wants to offset income tax. So collect more tariffs, charge less income tax, he reckons that's a win. And by the way, as retail politics goes, that is spectacularly good politics, right? Terrible policy, but great politics. Why? Because no one really notices that they're paying an extra 25 cents for some Chinese-produced chicken wire, right? You don't see it. But if then Donald Trump says, and by the way, here's your 5% tax cut, you're like, oh, I love this guy, it's amazing. Even if you're no worse off or no better off, you feel better because you're paying less tax, less visible tax, right? The tariff isn't a tax, it just is part of your price. So that kind of matters. Does Donald Trump want to charge tariffs? Yes, on one level. On the other level, I mentioned earlier, this is schoolyard bully stuff. This is literally, I will take your lunch money unless you run an errand for me, right? That's what this absolutely comes down to. So Trump starts with, here's a tariff. I would suggest within about maybe 3 days, a week, if we're lucky, we end up with a conversation where it's like, oh, actually, I've changed my mind. I had a good chat with Australia. I've decided to exempt Australian steel or Australian aluminium or both from these tariffs because they're a great friend of ours and we're doing this and we're doing that. You know, Trump starts with the big picture and then walks it back. It's just what he does. We've seen it so many times. It's the big announcement, the big, again, great press, great PR, great politics. And then he walks it back on Australia. It makes page 15 of the New York Times or the New York Post. We report on the front page, but no Americans care what we write in our papers. And all of a sudden it's all over. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if we end up getting exempted from this over time. What's really worrying though, mate, is actually not the direct tariffs on us. We make not much steel that gets sent to America, not much aluminium that gets sent to America. We send a whole lot more iron ore, as we've said, to China. And so if we get away with no tariffs, we'll, frankly, again, politics, the PM will say, look what I've done a great deal with Donald Trump. We fixed it. We're great friends. If the Chinese tariffs remain on all of their exports, which Trump's already announced, plus more again on top of that on steel and aluminium, then our iron ore exports to China, second order impact, not directly, but are still in the gun here and still do pose a real risk. So hopefully, if Gina Reinhart does have Donald Trump's ear, maybe get him to roll back the ones on China would help, because I suspect the indirect cost, i.e. iron ore to China, is probably bigger than direct steel exports from Australia to the US.
Okay, and just with your prime ministerial hat on, if you can, for a moment, what should the government do about this? What would you do?
Oh, man. It's a really difficult question, right? Because you're dealing with someone who's not wanting to play the rational game. There's two ways to look at this, right? Tony Abbott famously wanted to shirt front Vladimir Putin, right? That's Scott Morrison did the megaphone diplomacy with China that got our wine and barley and seafood tariffed in China. So we've been here before for 3 or 4 years. So you can do the I'll be the tough guy. I won't take this laying down. And a lot of your listeners will be saying, we need to protect our sovereign rights. We need to fight fire with fire. We need to tell him to go and take a long walk off a short pier. And that would be that version of it, right? That would feel good. On a national level, it even might be in our long-term interest, which is you can't push us around, but it's going to cost us money. The other way you do it is say, all right, now Donald Trump's a dealer. What do we need to do to make this go away? And it's, well, I need this and this and this from you. Okay, fine. You can have that. It's not great. It's worse than we are now, but it's much better than we would otherwise be if you left those tariffs in place. Given that Trump's here for 4 years, unless he manages to change the Constitution, I think you take the least worst option through for the next 3.5 years. Because at some point, he's replaced by somebody else. You have a different range of conversations. If the entire American bureaucracy, like the Chinese Communist Party, frankly, was, this is our party line, this is our national line, we're always never going to do this, you might say, well, we're going to have a fight, we might as well have it now. We might as well show you that we can't get pushed around. But when we know or assume that the president's got less than 4 years and with every passing day we're closer to the next president, you might choose a path which says, all right, you're going to be a bully, fine. I'm going to get the best for the Australian people I can in the next 3 and almost 4 years, and then we'll work out a new stance coming after that. I think that's what I do. Some will see it as weak, and I get that. But again, we're talking about jobs and livelihoods here and economic success or otherwise. I suggest probably making nice with Trump to get through to the end of his term is probably the least worst outcome for the Australian government.
Scott Phillips, thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Bension.
Scott Phillips there, Chief Investment Officer at the Motley Fool. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. If there's someone in your life who'd like to sound smart when people talk about Trump and tariffs around them, why not send them a link? And there's plenty of exclusive video content from us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.